Morning. As my old pastor would say, I have a long way to go and a short time to get there. Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant would be called a problem on the court. A problem when it comes to basketball or any type of sport is when a person is so good at what they do that they're just unstoppable. So you might hear someone say LeBron James or some of the young guys coming up today, he's a problem. She's a problem. The whole league needs to be mindful of this player because they are great, effective at what they do. I want to invite you or remind or encourage some of you to be a problem. Jesus stood before a group of Jews in the synagogue, reading a passage of scripture, and said, "Truly, I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his own hometown." One version says, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown." He said this just before the people would react with hostility to his reminder of the Old Testament stories of God's inclusiveness that went beyond them to the Gentiles. He challenged their sense of exclusive entitlement to God's favor. The hostility was expressed with violent intentions to throw him from a cliff. And I've been to the supposed location in Nazareth where this scene is believed to have occurred, and there would have been no surviving this. This was his hometown, a place where he was raised, nurtured, built relationships, participated in traditions and norms. He, like the other kids, would have been a product of that hometown. It reminds me of my Gullah roots in South Carolina. Anybody familiar with Gullah Geechee? No? Okay, there we go. Like anyone who grew up in the low country Gullah corridor on the coast of South and North Carolina, all the way down to the northernmost coast of Florida, the way that I thought and saw the world, although I didn't always fit in, is what shaped me, my Gullah culture, dialect, food, religious expressions, etc. But there is an expectation for the hometown boy to conform and speak and act like the locals do and respect the boundaries put in place by the community. In fact, if I spoke that same verse I read in my Gullah dialect, I would say, let me practice real quick. And Jesus say, "I'da tell una for true, ain't no prophet will ever get honor where he raise up." I had to really think about that. It's been a while. But Jesus grew up, was baptized by John the Baptist, and the Spirit fell upon him, as it says in John 1:32, and remained on him. He was the one. As the young folks say, he was him. He was a problem. He reads the passage, applies it to himself as being fulfilled in real time, and expounds upon the meaning of the text that would have been familiar with, but may not have really sat with what it was saying. The prophet Jesus is speaking to an unspoken problem, the problem of bondage and oppression, an inherent social hierarchy, exclusivity, a segregated, separated society. Jesus alludes to the problem, but it turns out that to the people, Jesus is the problem. The message of bringing good news to the poor, releasing captives, bringing sight to the blind, and freeing the oppressed while proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor is meant for the special house of Israel. It's for us, not for them. It's like the right to vote without barriers belongs to us, not them. It's like the reasonable aspirations to come to this country, especially out of desperation, to make a better life for oneself and one's children belongs to us, not them. Or to have access to all the rights that every other citizen enjoys, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, etc., only belongs to us, not them. Them can be a number of groups. Jesus, the prophet, is now the problem to them. He is causing them to have to deconstruct their theology in real time. It's disorienting. They feel the tectonic shift of the theological ground beneath them. This is the type of demand for deconstruction of theological thought that caused them to want to resort to violence. The prophet, Jesus, is the problem when he exposes the problem. Even though this is his literal hometown, I believe Jesus would allow for us to see it as a metaphor today where it can at least be expanded to speak to other contexts. Hometown is a place of birth, but also formation and familiarity that when there, one is expected to conform to, not disrupt, especially if it's a smaller space with a narrower worldview. The ideologies, theologies, philosophies, and ethics that are also formed and sustained in those places tend to be hardened and rigid, less flexible. I want to use this term hometown to also speak to the institutions we navigate, including the church. Spaces of rigid adherence to a particular way of thinking and being that upholds the institution without disrupting its ethos. The institution is also capable of violence to preserve itself and its power as is. And when I say institution, I'm talking about family institution, church, government, or corporations where the prophet must compete with the prophets. The institution is not hospitable to the prophet because the prophet is the problem. It doesn't matter how progressive they may claim to be, there is still a status quo that they will try to preserve. It's the nature of institutions. It will either domesticate the prophet or excommunicate the prophet. The prophet will either have to assimilate to keep the membership and the privileges or agitate and risk losing it all. I have known people who have grown up in families with a particular way of thinking politically and socially, and later they were exposed to perspectives beyond what their family had taught them. And then they began to challenge their parents and their siblings and grandparents on the ideology they no longer agree with or believe in. And they were met with hostility to the degree they did not feel welcomed in their own family. Or at the very least, the relationships were never the same. That can be a type of violence to a person. I have personally experienced the violence in terms of words, threats that included racial slurs, gossip and lies about my name, and backlash because I dared to expose the problems in the church with their theology and ethics, the ethics of indifference, the ethics of intentional ignorance, the ethics of endorsing or remaining silent in light of rhetoric that vilifies and demonizes groups of people with historically harmful narratives. The cliff they wanted to throw Jesus off of is a metaphor for the platform many wanted to push me off of. My reputation they wanted to destroy. My calling many hoped to revoke. Those were the cliffs they tried to throw me off of because I was the problem in that part of the institution we call the American church. All the forms of the institution's violence are meant to mute the prophet. Why? Because the prophet is the problem. But we need the prophet now more than ever. We need the prophetic voice to speak not just louder, but with more clarity and exposing the range of problems that plague institutions that even we hold dear. We need the prophetic voice to also shed light on a vision of shalom. Even if it's just in a particular space, a home, the local church community, the corporation that employs you. We need prophetic voices, but what happens when the prophet is tired? When the prophet is at the brink of nihilism, hopelessness, despair, cynicism begins to overwhelm the prophet. The prophet cannot just be an individual, it must be a community. Courageous enough to speak as Jesus did, even amid those who are prepared to respond with violent rhetoric, policies, or unwarranted punitive discipline. The prophet as community has to become the problem Jesus was as an individual to those institutions and spaces that withhold God's grace. The prophet as community, wait a minute, that's the church. The prophet as community must be willing to dramatize the problems that plague us and seek the justice and liberation that make up shalom. There must be some Aarons and Hurs in the community that can hold up the arms of the Moseses that have been on the front lines. If this is not the case, then we have another problem. It's not the one that the prophet is exposing. It's the one that the so-called prophetic community has been unwilling to acknowledge. Jesus, as the prophet, was a problem from the inside. He too was Jewish. He too was a man of faith. Many times he directed his attention to those inside the house. So if Jesus, as the prophet, was a problem, then when will the church as prophetic community rise up and embody the standard to speak truth consistently to power structures and not just when the issues hit their respective front door? Now, I know there are those factions of the church that if John were here, he would say they went out from us, but they did not belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But by going out, they made it plain that none of them belongs to us, 1 John 2:19. He would recognize and name the nationalists who never belonged to us and who have weaponized the faith by twisting scripture to support oppression and injustice. But my concern is with those who are among us, those who are more proximal to power, but have distanced themselves from prophetic engagement. My concern is with those who do belong to us, who are indifferent, silent, voluntarily ignorant, or apathetic to injustices that don't directly impact their lives negatively, or so they think. That is the problem. I confess I was one of them at one point. I close with an invitation to each of us in the ways that God has gifted and resourced us to be the problem Jesus was, to be an active part of the body known as the prophetic community that will not remain silent and comfortable. I had a friend of mine who himself is a Gullah Geechee native. They would say he Benya. Benya he's a native. He took his whole family, who are Gullah by blood but not by upbringing and culture, and they would call them Kamya. They Kamya. They weren't born there. They weren't native. He moved back home to Hilton Head, South Carolina, because as someone who is in real estate, he is helping his people to retain their land as corporations are trying to take the land that has been the place where the most preserved African culture in the country still exists. That's where I'm from. Gentrification efforts are relentless. This is an example of the prophetic voice in action, dramatized. His wife is even using her voice and her gifts to turn public parks into spaces that tell the Gullah Geechee history. She's being commissioned to embed the history within the public parks. Although her work is a gift to the city, they are both a problem. She is penetrating a space typically dominated by Southern older white men, and he is bringing a consciousness to the Gullah residents that helps them understand how they can keep their land. My invitation to you, like my friends who left California to go back to South Carolina, is to be the problem too. Jesus was a problem. The prophet is a problem. Be the problem.